Good afternoon. Thank you for being here during the lunch power panel on how is open source speeding cloud innovation. So we have got three experts here. I'll first let them introduce themselves, their companies, and then I'll start with my first question. And these guys don't have my questions, so so we're going to have an interesting discussion. And most of the times I'll do some of the questions, but if there is somebody who really has a burning question, raise your hand if I can see you. We can even take some questions from the audience. Okay? So.
I'm Corey Isaacson. I'm the CEO and CTO of Code Futures. We're the makers of DB Shards and the new product Agile Data that we just talked about. So we're very involved in big data, and we integrate a lot with open source technologies. So we have a good background in that area too.
Great. My name is John Derrick. I'm CEO of Gelastic. Gelastic's a provider of infrastructure software for both private and public clouds. We base it on open software standards, APIs, so open source is important from an API standpoint. And we support Java, Ruby, PHP, Python, Red Hat, open cartridge format, and all kinds of things. Company's been around for three and a half years, and we have customers in 5 continents.
Okay.
I'm Greg O'Connor, CEO of AppZero. AppZero, we provide a tool for helping customers move their applications from one machine to another machine. And the 2 big use cases these days is around Windows 2003 end of life, so you can pick up apps and move them to 2012, a modern operating system. And also a big motion for us is moving from apps from the data center to the cloud.
Great. So, open source is changing all of cloud computing. What Amazon has done, Google has done, a lot of folks have done, are all based on open source technologies. What do you see as the biggest open source movement and enterprises like to copy? Yesterday we had a lot of discussion on DevOps and how enterprises like to copy what large web companies, cloud companies are doing into their enterprises. How is open source going to start playing a role in enterprises? What are they going to start doing, and what are you seeing as the biggest open source movements? We keep hearing OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, what standards, what movements? I just want to get each one of your opinion. You want to start?
Oh, I can start with that. The common thing would be OpenStack and Cloud Foundry, those kinds of things. But I think the more interesting tier is actually on the application side and the database side. There's been a tremendous amount of information and integration and work in the Hadoop infrastructure and scalable databases. If any of you have been following Hadoop 2 and the whole movement to go to Yarn and multiple types of infrastructures in that environment, that's going to be very, very exciting, and it's going to make it much easier. So there's the whole management side, but I think what you're seeing is the actual data and infrastructure and application components, I think, are going to be used much more widely in enterprises over time. And I think what you'll see companies like ours that are adding value to those technology infrastructures. We actually use a lot of open source components inside the products that we build. We're very open about that, and we really leverage them, and we make them better in ways that we think are really important and need support. But at the same time, like I said, those technologies are getting better and better. And you have everything, like I said, from big data technologies to streaming technologies to application frameworks, and all of the big companies, including Yahoo, Twitter, Google, they're all helping us by giving us proven things that they've actually used in their own infrastructures. That's kind of a neat position to be in, actually, in the marketplace, to have the most successful companies in the whole industry actually teaching you how to do things. So.
Great. John?
I think it's actually an interesting question because we talk about open source, and basically it's an API. It's a contract with how things are going to be developed. And so we can look back in history a little bit, but look at Java. Java as a language environment has opened up all kinds of innovation, libraries and packages on top of it. The same thing is happening in the market today. So Ruby, PHP, other things that are essentially standards, open source kind of formats. But the key thing is to allow people to develop and invest their technology efforts and their investments in new areas where they differentiate and create value. I actually am concerned about the cloud market when it comes to open source right now, though, because some of these packages, the ones that you mentioned, actually are somewhat proprietary. There's APIs and things that you've got to code differently to move to those different platforms. It's something that we have actually at Gelastic have stayed very far away from because we believe take the packages, the Java application, just as it is, be able to bring it into environment and run it with value there as opposed to getting tie-in. Because tie-in can still be within Java, or tie-in can still be within an open standard. And so we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't just do open source and then still have the same binds, the same ties or restrictions that we had in the past.
So I guess one of the open source projects that we're keenly interested in and I think has had a tremendous uptake this year is called Docker. So how many people have heard of Docker? All right, about a third of the group. So Docker is a container and it allows really purpose, I think, for DevOps. So it's a way really to allow developers to place their application artifacts or pieces of infrastructure inside a container and then move that from machine to machine. So from a selfish point of view, we sort of have an interest in that. There's a DockerCon, so they released the first production shipment of it this week. So that's seen a lot of uptake, and it really allows people to speed development so you don't have to wait for provisioning a VM. So we went from a couple weeks to provision machines when they were physical to a couple hours on provisioning VMs, and now with Docker containers you can provision your app in a matter of seconds. So it's really sort of, I think, ushering on a big part of the infrastructure for DevOps, and then it's a big part of open source. So it's really open source container, open source framework, and the amount of people that have joined the projects that are associated with Docker has been pretty tremendous this year. Okay, I'm going to ask the audience a question. If the Santa Clara or the next New York convention, we have a track just on containers, would that be useful for those over here? Okay, I see a few hands, not much, but there is some interest in containers. But I'm thinking that that's one area that I agree is growing, really hot on, at least from what I've been seeing in the market for the last few. So the other thing with Docker is that there's the Go language. So does anyone use or know about language called Go?
Yep.
So a couple people there. All right.
You want to say something about Go?
What Go again is maybe the Java next iteration. So I think as new technologies come on, they're often brought to market with speed of innovation. So one of the big parts of Go is it compiles. You can recompile the whole dev SDK in a matter of less than a minute. So a lot of the DevOps movement is really about time to deployment, really time to deployment. So Go language was started by Google, and it's a language, I'd say, that's probably trying to be simpler, trying to encompass pulling along the right infrastructure. It compiles a lot faster. It's not been around very long, maybe 2 years. So a lot of the Docker apps that are built are built in Go. You don't have to build it in Go, but it sort of comes with the territory.
John and Corey, you want to say anything about containers or just in general on that?
Yeah, I mean, containers are a key part of the business, but a container is, in some ways, a container or a runtime environment like that is just a toolkit.
Okay.
And really what we're trying to do at Gelastic, sorry about that, is we're really creating a full turnkey cloud, right? So you can go from not having anything installed software-wise to having a full cloud running in a matter of hours. And then certainly the development statement about provisioning and doing something like that, that's a seconds kind of thing, right? And we're watching Docker. We've run Docker internally, right? So just a little secret there, little R&D thing. But we're really focused on providing whatever APIs, whatever essential contract that we have with the runtimes, with the code, with our customers that they need can be supported and managed in a turnkey cloud environment.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the whole idea of containers is a very, very important infrastructure in actually managing a cluster of servers. And I can tell you for any database cluster in particular, it's really a bear. And there really aren't good ways to do it yet. And we're working hard on that as well with other open source projects to try and make that much, much easier. And containers are a key part of it, but it's not the only part of it. You have a lot of configuration management. You have a lot of operational management. You have to have real-time picture and view into what's going on in the cluster. All those things are very, very difficult and quite challenging to actually put all of that together.
So the next question is a little more, a little controversial. So does open source really matter is if a cloud provider is providing you all the services you need as an enterprise, as a customer, as a startup? Do they really care about what's behind it? And why is it important? What's the community doing? I do understand the community and what it does. So I just want to reflect on that kind of subject. Does that really matter?
I think it matters in a tremendous way, because the truth is it used to be that we would have big enterprise offerings that would end up being de facto standards that we would use. And you were kind of in this camp or that camp, but there were only a few ways to go. Today, there's 1,000 ways to go. And so now we have standards evolving from open source technology, but they're based on what's popular and what's really common and what's really solving a lot of problems for other people and what's really successful. And there's so much work going on, and it's at such an incredible pace, and so many thousands of people are working on it. It's a lot to keep up with, but the point is we are going to end up with de facto standards from open source software. There are a lot already, and there are going to be more. And it's really an interesting exercise. I think I recommend everyone do it, is when you're looking at these products, see which ones you think are going to be the winners and try and go with those, because it doesn't matter if it's just the best technology. It has to be well supported in the future. And it's just the same as it was with enterprise as it is with open source. If you don't pick one that is going to be popular, it won't be supported in the future. And there are a lot of dead open source projects, I can tell you that for sure.
Okay.
So.
I think it's real important to pick that right level of interface, right? You mentioned there's a lot of open source projects that have failed, and the reason is because they haven't, or they've stalled. I won't call them dead yet, right? So they may come back, but there's a lot of things that stall, and the reason is because it's not offering the value that people need today, right? And so I think open source as a API, as a contract with developers for the program owners is very key, and that's why we're really focused on open source as a API, as an interface standard, and then make sure that we support the ones that are popular. There's ones that we don't support yet because they're not popular enough in the enterprise, for example, but we're watching them and we'll add them as they need to be.
So I'd say open source is more an economic model, and that allows a lot of people to come and bring innovative products or services to market faster. So if everyone had to start up a company and raise capital and then start the project and then go through beta, sort of time to allow other people to use it, it would be a lot longer. So, I think really open source provides a vehicle for the community and people to innovate and allows the enterprise to adopt new technology a lot faster. So, I think it's very important in changing the landscape and allowing new services to come to market, and in particular in a way that can be consumed. Open source is perceived to be free. It's not really free, probably from the support point of view, which I think is probably a whole different discussion. But it certainly ushers on a way where people can come together, create new offerings, and bring them to market in a much more fast way than previous models.
I actually, just to add something there, I think one of the key things is open source consumers and producers of things that interface or work with open source that we need to remember is invest your time, invest your technology dollars in things that's going to add value, right? The whole value of open source is I can go use Linux, for example, right? Or I can go pick Java or something that's kind of out there that's already defined. And you don't have to go recreate everything all the time.
Right.
At the same time, make sure that it does work with something that's standardized, right? One of the challenges we're seeing with our customers is, some of these, quote, open source projects, there's a lot of different versions of them, right? And they're not necessarily any more open, than a proprietary offering in many cases. So, if you have, 14 versions or 17 versions of a particular software cloud standard, how does that help you, right? It's related, but you're still stuck in the support. And you're talking about cost of open source. You're still stuck in the support and ongoing maintenance problem.
Yeah, I think the good news is there's lots of innovation and new services or products brought to market, but then it leaves sort of the onus on, are you going to adopt the one that's a winner? So, you get a lot more choices, but with the choices, there's the downside of maybe picking the wrong one.
That's right. And another point I would add to your comment about the economics of it and the economic factors is it's really important, I think, with any open source project to look at who's behind it and why. I think that's pretty important, and is the company upfront about it? Because the truth is there's huge amounts of capital going into open source. If you look at companies like Pivotal and Hortonworks and Cloudera, I mean, you're talking there I think more than $250 million have gone into just those 3 companies to date. And there's others I could name as well. So some of these companies and these open source projects are very, very heavily funded. Obviously, those investors are expecting to get a return for that, which I'm not opposed to. I'm certainly in the same exact situation as a lot of those companies. But so if the company is going to make money, it's important that if you're going to start to adopt that product, what is going to be their model, and make sure that you really understand it. Because there are some ways to do it that are honestly not very friendly and not very open. I'll just tell a story from, this was really about 10 years ago, and it's certainly not very common today, but there was a consultant I met, and he said, yeah, I built some stuff for customers, and then I open sourced the whole thing, and I'm the only one in the world who can support it. It's great.
So you think Intel's going to want a return from their $740 million investment in Cloudera?
Very possibly.
That was see, you said $250 million.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I thought it was a lot more than that.
I'm behind the times. So.
Yeah, I thought it was a lot more than that.
Behind
But
the
that's
times.
so we talk about open source and removing lock-in, but everybody needs support, and you're going to get a supported version from one of the vendors, and there are multiple forks. And then do you still get locked into somebody's version of it? And what are the things you need to consider in making that kind of decision? I just wanted to have you guys talk about it.
It's absolutely true, and I think you have to pick the vendor, again, for the same reasons. Which one is going to win? Which one is going to be, give you fair business terms that you can actually live with? We all need help to do this. The real trap that can be in open source is you can say, oh, wow, it's free and we can do all this stuff. We'll put, 5-year developers on it, and they may go down a hole and never come out. It's very, very easy to chew up a huge amount of time in very non-productive ways if you're getting into a lot of projects that are difficult to work with. So it's very, very important to pick the right team that you're going to work with, and also I think to get that expertise in-house as much as possible. So if you're going to pick a team, pick one that's going to help you build that expertise in your own organization so that you're not, again, stuck with a situation that you don't like.
So this is going to sound a little controversial, but I'll actually answer the question about how we expect to make money, because we use open source as well. I actually believe, as I've mentioned already, that I believe that the open source interface should be the language, or should be the runtime environment. Everything else underneath needs to be supported and needs to be able to provide value to your enterprise immediately. It doesn't need to be a project. In fact, it shouldn't be a project. And so we see a lot of companies that they're looking at OpenStack, they're looking at Pivotal, they're looking at open cartridge format, they're looking at a bunch of different things. Sometimes they're choosing multiple because they don't know which one's going to start. If they're going into the cloud, they may be using APIs for particular public hosting vendors. We've said don't do any of that. Right? Keep the API, keep the open source interface easy. Do it at the language level, do it at the standards level, and don't force people into the different kind of proprietary trap, so that they don't have this support issue that's lingering, or this question or issue. Our market, our value proposition is such that if we continue to provide value through our software packages, our customers will continue to grow and use more of us. But we're not going to lock them into that, because it's actually a trap, to quote a little Star Wars. So it's a trap.
So, I always hear the stuff about lock-in and how people don't want to be locked in. And, I think the reality is you're always locked in, right? When you code to APIs, even if there's sort of a standard and an ability to move, that's a lie. It's a marketing thing. You're always locked in. There's some behavior behind that API that you take advantage of above. And you can move, but the moving is expensive, and really no one ever moves. I mean, it's very difficult to adopt this, and that, and then put it together in a composite application, and then at some point in the future think you can move, because you just probably can't. So I think back to the point of selecting the APIs and the services or application components that are important and are the winners, you are going to be locked in, and you're going to have to live with that for a long, long period of time. So it is really important when you start off a project to pick the right ones, because the reality is you're going to be locked in. And I've never seen a company make money on breaking lock-in. Is there an example of a company that got the $740 million for breaking lock-in? But yet you always hear, oh, we don't want to be locked in. But I think the reality is there's a good argument that you're always locked in.
So I'll push back on that a little bit, right? And the reason is, we have hosting companies that we've sold to, we've licensed software to worldwide. So, public hosting companies, their application, their environments exactly as they are can run on any of those environments. It also can be installed inside their own private data center. It looks exactly the same. You can't tell the difference. Most of the time it's installed in bare metal because it's the cost advantage solution. But we have customers install on top of VMware, goes on top of Azure, can run on top of Google App Engine, as well as others. And so our whole purpose as a company from a software provider is to eliminate that funkiness of moving from one place to the other and making it to where you take an existing application and graphically be able to drop it in and make it work.
So I think you have the choice to deploy in lots of different places, but how many of your customers deploy in Azure and then would move someplace else? So I think the act of actually deploying where it looks open and you have lots of choices, lots of choices doesn't necessarily mean it's going to really in the future be cost effective to move. So most people, when they get there and whatever they use, they stay with that. And the moving parts, because I'm in the moving business, so let me tell you, the moving parts are really expensive. And you use parts of the infrastructure, whether it's designed to or not, in some way that probably makes it very difficult to move.
So we see people deploying in a hybrid solution where they have some overflow, right? That's kind of a key thing for them. And then because it's geographically, we're very diverse in our customer set. We have the same customers, well, actually not our customers customers, actually choosing from using different vendors of the same solution.
Right, and again, I think that's, can deploy to lots of places, write once and run anywhere. But once you're running anywhere, are you really going to move and run somewhere else?
It should be an economic choice. It shouldn't be. So it's an economic choice. It shouldn't be a question of, if we move this, it's going to break, or if we move this, I've got to go reconfigure everything, right? And so that's the part we've eliminated.
That's where if it's truly open, then you should be able to move it without having to be a choice. But it brings some overheads. Sometimes you have a lot of issues.
But making it easy to deploy like that, right? Making it easy to deploy like that, not adding all the extra funkiness, if you will. That's actually our value proposition because, we want people to be able to take their open source applications, open source standard-based applications, be able to push them into the cloud and be running in a matter of minutes.
I keep hearing that, write once, run
exactly.
that kind of thing all the time. But,
exactly.
But you all brought up APIs.
So there's a good question here we could ask the audience. So, the prices went down with Google entering the market, Amazon lowered their prices, Azure and everyone followed. So, who deployed in Amazon and is now moving to Azure because Azure prices are lower. And
anybody moved a whole application.
Deployed and then gone through and figured out with this portal thing that they can move, and was it cost effective?
I have a question. If there will be no possibility to move, the prices will go down. No?
Okay. So the question is,
I don't think my premise is really that you can't move. But there's probably an economic cost to moving that will outweigh the benefit of moving to a lower platform. So I think in the cloud world where the economics of scale that an Amazon or a Microsoft can provide, makes it very desirable for the enterprise to adopt the cloud. And whether that's in the development side of the equation or it's in web-facing equations or moving legacy applications there's going to be an economic model where the scale that Amazon and Google and Microsoft are going to be able to create infrastructure to run your applications is probably going to be far superior to than a do-it-yourself what enterprise can do. So if it's just based on an economic basis, I think there's a great reason to get there, but the cost of migrating and the cost of changing, how people think and where you log in and your credentials and all the pieces that are over and above the standard APIs just becomes very difficult and cost prohibitive.
Yeah, but I have one other comment, though, is we have had customers that actually will run in more than one cloud as a disaster recovery solution, and I think that's a very, very viable option. And the other is that what we're seeing for sure is that some cloud vendors have different services than other cloud vendors. For instance, BigQuery and Redshift are two fairly similar products for similar needs, but they work much, much differently. And one might be a lot better for what you're doing than another one. And you might want to run your infrastructure in one and use that service in another. I mean, why can't you do that? It shouldn't be that hard to do. And that doesn't mean even necessarily moving your whole application. Again, it's taking advantage of these APIs and all the open source technology that's around it. and it really should be much, much easier to do that. Because
Okay, so you guys, a lot of you all brought up APIs, and you can continue that thing.
Well, and I keep saying, don't worry about the APIs. Use
Okay.
ones that are standard. You don't need to worry about that, really.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe me, we'll
No,
but that's fine.
I understand, yeah.
But I think I do actually have kind of a question for the audience in some form, which is,
Okay.
we talk about cloud a lot, and sometimes that's public cloud or something like that. But there's still a massive amount of data that's still private cloud data, or even less cloudified. It's just not in the cloud yet, right? But I think the economics for a lot of companies actually it moves kind of opposite, right? I've got more of a venture. I guess my background is more venture capitalists out west, but the issue there is, a lot of people will start their project using Amazon or using something that's really easy to kind of get going with. And once they start growing, all of a sudden they find, I've got a lot of data that I really wish it was in a private cloud, right? And so sometimes they'll go build another cloud and bring in their critical, user interaction data, that sort of thing for gaming or whatever. Or just economically, it starts looking like I'm paying, millions and millions of dollars. I actually can do this cheaper myself if, and this is a key if the software is portable, if the environment's ready to go and turnkey and it doesn't become a big project, right? So I think that's really the key issue.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
How do you launch the
We
software?
talk about, data gravity has been talked a lot about, how much you already have and what's the cost of moving it off after you have already created a gravity on one platform or one place, and movement of that is an issue. But from the API standpoint, there has been a couple of rulings recently about is APIs patentable or not. And just overall with that area, are there going to be some government regulations needed to really still grow and promote open source, especially in the US? With a lot of the...
Well, I would hope not.
That they don't have to change much. Okay.
But I will say about APIs, though, because I think it's a good point, is it's an obvious strategy from a cloud vendor that the more high-level services they can get you to use, they're going to make it impossible for you to move, or very, very difficult, or very, very challenging. And so it's not a bad way to go, but again, you need to think through it and say, how long do I want to be able to do that? Whereas the other side of it, which you have available to you, is if you can implement on top of open source technology that is portable, then you have a chance to move and do things, in the future in the way that you want to. So it is important to actually look at this because, again, maybe I'm a little bit cynical, but I try and really look at someone's motivation behind what they're doing. Like I said, if it's open source, well, why is it open source? If there's $1 billion behind that open source product, why is there $1 billion behind that? There's for some reason, right? Someone isn't doing it just for, philanthropy usually.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about
and even if the company wants to do it for good purposes or just for the fun of it, their venture capitalists won't.
That's right.
So
that's right.
No, I think getting the APIs kind of standardized is fine, but I think that takes time to kind of get things to mature. That's one of the reasons why our customer base is really, we have support in R&D for a lot of these new emerging standards, but the bulk of our customer set, they're doing Java, Ruby, PHP, SQL, non-SQL databases, interfacing to Oracle, doing things like that in mass instances. Generally, governing bodies will really kill innovation, and governments probably even worse so because they're probably less informed about the technology.
Yes, that I agree with.
And so having people do regulatory discussions and decisions about things that are quite deep and technical will probably actually cause us more pain than it's worth. If you don't believe it, we can look at, all kinds of, financial regulations, telecommunications regulations, whatever. There's lots of examples of that.
I'd agree with that. I think if the government gets involved and you can patent APIs, then, that's the thing that'll slow down the innovation train.
Yeah.
So hopefully that doesn't happen, but maybe that's the marker that it's gone mainstream and it's getting too fast that the government's now trying to slow it down with regulation.
Well, I think another thing is, if there's something you can't add to the value of it, then maybe spend your time and effort innovating some other place.
Right.
And so, so if there's a real need, I think the market and technology creators like you guys will actually create that, identify that much faster than the government would.
I totally agree, and we certainly don't want laws being put in place that are based on which vendor had the biggest checkbook to write to the lobbyists. That wouldn't be a great way to do it.
Yeah.
So
people who then raise, $500 million or more in capital will probably have an advantage at that point.
That's right.
So, when I see, companies coming up with new solutions for cloud or cloud-based solutions, there are the startups who just take open source products and don't pay any support. They're their own supported organization and they build it on. Do you see that kind of mentality, from people buying a non-supported version of some open source software and saying we're going to run it ourselves? Are enterprises going to start getting into that and saying we will do our own support? Are they going to take that risk? Are they going to get the skills to do that? Because private or startups do that because that's their only choice. They don't have money to do much more than that.
That's exactly where I've seen it, is mostly in the startup community. I think it's starting to happen in enterprise more, but I think that the enterprise is much more likely to use a vendor to actually help, get things going. But with startups, you don't have any capital, so you go and you find the latest thing and you learn it as well as you can, and then you run. That's typically how it goes.
So you'll never see in the near future or some kind of future that they're going to say, it's so big, let's just take the risk and do it ourselves.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, someone explained it to me in a very good way, which is they said that open source is really a different sales model, and that what it used to be that you would sell to the CIO and work your way down in an enterprise. And now what it is a developer can go download something and try it, and then he'll recommend it to his boss, and then that's how it goes. And so there's a lot of that going on for sure, right? But then how you're going to actually make the economic decision to make sure that you have the expertise and can really support it, it just does need to be looked at. Because like I said, you can chew up a lot more time with an open source product that is hard to learn, than you can actually save. But sometimes it's the exact opposite. So it really depends on the project and how mature it is and how you're using it and what your use case is, and also how critical is it. Are you writing your whole basic infrastructure on this thing, or is it just going to be a small project that's an experiment? Then it really doesn't matter near as much.
John?
So businesses are in the business of making money. Right? And if your business isn't a technology company, if you're not a software vendor yourself, then typically they don't have a lot of purpose and reason to do that, to go develop their own internal expertise and basically become the OpenStack expert or whatever. The key thing is to have dependable technology that they can utilize, that they can develop on, not get trapped, and be able to get to the business of doing business. And so I think that's, so what we've been focused on is, how do we package it up, get it to them in a very fast, clean way, without the lingering, what happens if the standard changes a little bit right away? What happens if someone switches which container that they're using, for example? What do we do about that, right? And kind of get companies moving and actually, in production mode and keep them in production mode, through all the ups and downs of the technology fads, I guess, to some degree.
And I don't know if I'm sure I agree with you saying business are not in the software, because now everybody says everybody needs to be a software company. And I know, you got companies like GE opening whole big facilities in San Ramon, California, with 2,000-3,000 developers just, building a whole platform around their products, their physical products. Right. So I've seen those kinds. There are certain few people that
there are a few companies that do that. I've done this is actually my third, open standard software-based company. First one being Java, second one being around XML, this one being cloudish type stuff. And, we found a lot of companies and all through that history of people who were trying to move to an open source environment and then looking at how much that cost. And at some point, it's not about how much you spend or how much expertise you have or how many developers you have internally. It's about results. It's always about results. And so, I think it will help. It'll keep their vendors honest, right?
Okay.
If nothing else. But, and they do need some expertise to kind of drive and be able to mold and shift, large vendors even, that are providing solutions to them. But even those companies are actually quite few. Most companies, don't have development technologies to do all that. They take a solution from someone, right? And developing applications and workflows and everything else, that's different, right? Everyone's going to need to do that because everybody's business is a little bit special, a little bit different. But what is different is no one goes out today and goes and builds their own operating system. Why is that? Well, there's an adequate, good one out there already.
Yeah.
You know, no one should go out and build their own virtual machine for Java or PHP engines or Ruby or anything else or databases too often, right? They're going to buy it from someone who's got expertise on how to do that. And so I think that's, you know, I think that's the natural evolution for the cloud is go to the right vendors who can provide the solutions that can immediately work. And you know, the more it becomes a design services agreement or consultancy or ongoing, you know, thing, you know, the more it starts looking like I'm buying software from this one vendor and I'm locked in because they're the only people that understand how it works.
Right.
Right. And so then, you know, and that's a problem, right? It's a problem for the cloud actually getting adopted and growing as fast as it should.
So we spend, I'd say, a lot of time mostly with the Fortune 500. And, you know, I watch, so our tool helps people move applications from one place to another. And I watch the regulations and the policies and procedures that they have to go through to get a password for the Oracle database or the SQL database they're trying to move. So, you know, I think when we talked about regulation and the government and slowing that down, you know, most Fortune 500 companies where the IT is to support some business that's not a software business. So if I'm Google, it might be different, but you know, most Fortune 500 companies just have a lot of policy and procedure that, you know, probably would stamp out any adoption of, you know, doing my own thing with my own open source stuff and augmenting it. It's just, you know, I'm sure there's pockets of that, but, you know, for the majority of what IT represents in the Fortune 500, if you're not a software company, you know, there's just a lot of regulation to make sure that it's recorded and it can be rolled back and who's got approval and an audit trail and all those sorts of things that, you know, I just find that hard to believe that they'd be able to adopt open source no matter how much they want to.
I'm going to let the audience, if anybody has a question that I have not covered, I'll ask one last question. Yeah, go ahead.
The question is not directly related to open source, but it's more related towards going towards big data and
Yep.
automation.
Okay.
One of the biggest challenges that most enterprises have is they have a ton of data right now.
Yeah. So quick question so I can repeat it and let the thing. So what is the question?
The question is, how do they switch, how do they bridge the gaps between the old and the new?
Okay, so good question. That's because that is kind of related to, you know, you have old, which is maybe non-open source, and new, which is more open source. So how do you bridge the gap between data, which is, you know, in on-premises to new data formats and technologies that is open? So how do you migrate, and what does
Well,
that
a self-serving answer is you can call us and we'll help you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you might know about how to do that, right?
No, but I mean, it's a challenge that all of our customers are doing, whether they're, you know, all the people we know that are doing it, whether they're working with us or not. And it takes a plan and it takes a strategy. You know, we're working with one customer now that actually, you know, already built an application like that, and they moved it to, you know, like I said, several different databases, and it's, you know, it's functioning okay, but it was a huge effort and it was very, very complicated, and it could have been done in a much more streamlined way. So again, it takes knowledge and expertise. So if you are going to jump on and do it yourself, make sure you get help from somebody who really knows how to do it at least, right? But then there are technologies, you know, like ours that will help make it much, much easier. So.
And this is not just for data, it's about anything. You could be having application workloads, it could be, you know, something written in some age-old technology.
I will say, though, one thing, though, is that the data is where it's hard, right? Moving applications around is 100 times
really
easier.
easy, I hear.
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier, right? I mean, you're dealing with this too.
Okay, I'm going to call you when I want to move a mainframe application over to Amazon, and you're going to say it's just very easy, but data is hard. Okay.
Easier, yeah.
So it depends on what that mainframe application is written in, but yeah. So, you know, you actually asked a good question, but you know, we've got massive amounts of data, and everyone's adding so much data so much faster that you've got to be able to reach back and be able to, you know, get that data in format, you know, move it to a structured data format, you know, in some form, so it'll be accessed and processed by modern, you know, modern technology. But there's so much new data that's showing up, right? And you know, I think some industries are just naturally difficult to do that with. You know, so insurance industries, you got records that go back forever. You know, we were processing. You know, we had a platform processing EBSIDIC records, right? You know, kind of thing, right? Because the data never disappears, right? But new data shows up, and you know, all the EBSIDIC records you ever had. Sorry for mainframe records format anyway, 1972 or so, right? So. But all the new stuff is going to overwhelm it in terms of quantity. And so the big question, I think, is actually how do you have leverage open source open standards, really, of data format, things like that, to where you can actually reach back in and get wisdom from that data. Not just have data. We all have data. It's a question of actually being able to search it, to index it, to probe inside of it, to be able to write applications using open source-based languages, but to reach in and actually mine that data as the economics of that processing, become advantageous to do so.
Okay. So I'd say there's a whole huge category called hybrid cloud, which is sort of 1 foot in one camp and 1 foot in the other. And in some sense, I see the transition going from mainframe to mini to the web to the cloud. And I think hybrid cloud, is the way to sort of bridge the gap. And sort of in my mind, a little bit like screen scraping your mainframe until you move it to the mini or whatever. But certainly, the internet and the network is the small straw and the big drink, and it takes a long time to move from one place to another. I've seen people put stuff on disk and FedEx it from one place to another. I mean, that's really a weird way to get there, given you have all this technology, you're going to put it on a truck. So it's going to take a long time, and I think hybrid cloud's really, sort of to bridge those camps.
Good. Any other quick question from the audience? And I'm going to ask one last question, and we'll close out. Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, so my last question was, some folks use from open source, startups and technology companies, and contribute back. Some don't contribute back. Is it all based on, more of an honor system, or do you see that vendors or customers, enterprises can see that and say, yeah, these guys are contributing back, so they probably know more about it. Maybe we should use them. Is that play a role at all in decision making as to, what they should do and which open source technology product they should pick, or what should be? Obviously, they have to pick one which is most appropriate for what they do, but there are other aspects that go away with them.
Yeah, well, I think any good open source project doesn't have a lot of committers, which is a good thing, right there. That's a very, very controlled process. I think where the user community helps a lot is with bug reports. You see it on the forums and things like that, where people can make bugs that are reproducible. That's tremendously valuable. I know because we run the Map2B open source project, and it's incredibly helpful when we get bug reports from the community. And it's really amazing because we get more testing done in 1 day after a release than we could do in a month. I mean, it really does work that way. And we get great feedback, and we can say, oh my God, here's this list, and we go through it, and we make the product much, much better. So I think that does happen a lot. If you are looking for somebody who's going to help you adopt an open source technology, definitely look for somebody who's a contributor, or at least helping quite a bit on that technology and has done a lot with it, because for sure they're going to know a lot more. These things, by the way, are getting more and more complicated and bigger all the time, and so it's really a daunting task to get into the code yourself on many of these projects. It's not for the faint of heart at all. So,
what are your thoughts on that contribution back, and who's really knows that technology?
So I think it gets to the stakeholders, right? So if and like I mentioned, I've been involved in open source and other places before. For example, in compilers. So if you're doing compiler feedback, you have a vested interest for the compiler to work very well, for your platform, whatever that looks like, whether it's Java or even a C compiler or whatever. So that's very important. When you get to the broader environment, I think you're right. I think the expertise level, right, of the people that are the committers needs to be really high. In fact, if you're looking at open source packages of things that you might include in your development, looking to see the quality level and the provenness of the software, it doesn't matter if there's 20,000 quote contributors. In fact, that might be something to run away from, right? You want to see things that have been very well architected, very tight community, very high profile, expertise, right? Proven experience, right? So I think that's more important than the number. And so probably the best service that some companies can do is actually not commit back.
So I certainly think the community knows whether someone's playing and sharing back, right? And GitHub has just, tremendous tools for visibility, so you can see who contributed, how much they contributed. So there's an easy way to figure out, and it sort of depends who you're trying to influence. If you're trying to influence people who are part of the community, if you're not sharing back, that's going to be pretty well known, I think. something. So, but maybe, above, if you're not contributing back and you're, talking to a CIO who's not spending his time in GitHub looking at the history reports, that's probably a ways away. But there's great visibility into what's going on within these communities.
Good. With that, we finish our session, on open source. And thank you to our panelists, and thank you for your attendance. Give them a hand.
Thank you.